It's the college football show from fantasyinsiders.com. We have Ben Pritchett at Natural Slugger on Twitter, the lead college football writer over on FI, along with Joe DeSalvo from the CFF site at the CFF site on Twitter. I'm Dan Strafford. We're going to get into Saturday's slate of games. Ben, but first, this is a week of some talented players on Thursday night. We've watched Baylor get a little bit of a scare from Kansas State, but we also saw the rise of a freshman here who seems all just as talented as anybody else in college football. What do you take from this Baylor game, and what do you see going forward for that offense?
Yeah, I think they're going to be just fine. I mean, if you read Fear My Turtle's article, I hate calling him that, but that's what we call him, Fear My Turtle. Um, if you read his article this week, he just slayed it. And one of the things he brought up was just how good Stidham is and how he's not just a system quarterback, but he's going to do well in this system just because he's a good quarterback. Highly recruited, lots of stars next to his name. So he did great. I mean, the ball looked as good as Seth Russell. He looked just as good as anybody that they've had in the last few years. So I don't think they need to worry one bit. Now, the decision making towards the end of the game when things got tight, he got a little off. But Corey Coleman is unbelievable. He's so good, and I don't know how he's going to translate as an NFL pro, maybe as a slot guy, but he's built so differently than anybody we've dealt with in a while. I mean, he's 5'11" with 220. So it's like a weird, big but small, can do anything, jump, run. I mean, he's just a freak. So I think they'll be just fine. I think Joe would agree with me there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had Stidham and Coleman up in the rankings. We talked about this before we came on the air. If there was a week that you were going to jump on Corey Coleman, if you followed us, you were on him. You were going to be on him. But if you shied away because of the quarterback situation, well, then it was your loss tonight.
It was a fun game to watch, and you get Coleman doing what he does. Some good scores across college football, and we're dealing with college football from Tuesday on through Saturday right now. And as Ben pointed out, Fear My Turtle doing the midweek write-up, several different articles this week because of the variety of slates between Tuesday and Friday, the Thursday only, the Friday only. And then you have Jordan Case's article as well, which has been dubbed dumpster diving by Mr. Case, but a place to find value plays in college football and find the guys on the cheaper side that are going to be able to bring you through and roster the guys who are a little bit more expensive. Now, Joe, Ben, looking back at last week, any storylines, any injuries, Joe, anything that we need to be keeping track of as we get ready to discuss week number 10 of the college football season?
Just a handful of them this week. It looks like Dalvin Cook will be back. I mean, Jacques Patrick came and had that monster week for Florida State last week. We don't know what's going on there at quarterback right now with Everett Golson, Sean McGuire, and you still have Jordan Canzeri, Iowa out, Leonte Carew. That looks like a big question mark right now. I'm kind of cautioning owners to stay away from that. Looks like Seth Collins may not play again for Oregon State. And then on the late slate as well, when we get into that, looks like Tommy Armstrong's back for Nebraska. Newbie still a question. JT Barrett obviously out. That'll be a big storyline I'm sure we'll talk about as we go. And then Nick Wilson, running back for Arizona, is doubtful with Juju Smith, the wide receiver at USC. That's a big one that's going to show up on that's going to have a factor on the late slate as well. So those are some of the major injury news that we'll be talking about, I'm sure, throughout the show.
Ben, as you're doing research for this early slate, I know, hey, I gotta say, article was up more than 24 hours in advance of the slate, and we always appreciate that, and I know certain members of the FI community do as well. But the question I have for you is, did anything stick out? Were there is a specific position you felt was priced incorrectly, or top heavy, bottom heavy? Where did you see really standout information this week in college football?
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot that just stood out. I mean, we are really in the the thick of everything. I mean, we are right there. I mean, Joe was talking about how they're kind of getting towards the end of the yearly season for college football. Well, we're right in the thick of the daily fantasy season. So you kind of have to be more matchup dependent than you are necessarily price dependent and just be looking at all these injuries. You were talking about injuries, Joe, and I immediately went to the Michigan situation where Jake Rudock's going to be starting. He got cleared to play, which really makes me upset because I was excited. I spent so much time looking at Wilton Speight. I was excited to get the chance to maybe roster him. I think he's a really good talent. I was impressed with what I saw. But yeah, that's a guy, that whole situation is one you want to monitor because Rutgers defense, as we have established every single episode, is terrible. Jake Rudock actually isn't a terrible option. I can't believe I'm even saying that on DraftKings as a second quarterback. But I think when I was looking over it, Kentucky's got a little bit of a situation with their running back. Mikael Horton's going to be the starter, so Boone Williams is out. He's priced really cheap because I don't think they accounted for that. Georgia's run defense is solid, but they have struggled when they've lost. They've really been really bad against the run. Don't know how that's going to translate here. I don't know if they're going to be fired up. As a Georgia fan, I really don't know what's going on with the team as a whole. They've had a physical altercation today. They've had issues with quarterbacks and bringing in a third string quarterback to be the quarterback. Now he's playing safety, scout team safety. They don't really know what the hell they're doing. So we're just going to have to figure out. We'll dig into some of the plays here in a little bit, but beyond that, I'm pretty square.
Yeah, the news out of Georgia about the defensive coordinator, Fran Tarkenton, coming out and bashing the quarterback, all sorts of strange goings on for the Bulldogs, and you try your best to keep up with the narratives there and how it influences the thing. I know Dave Locker and I talk about a lot. Or in the end, these are people too. There are things that will influence them, and we try our best to navigate those narratives, as it were, and understand where they are. But we keep an eye on all of them. Joe, looking early, and we'll get to some plays shortly, covering the early slate. Looking at these early slate games, the 12s and the 3:30 time span here, are there any over-unders or spreads that stick out to you, numbers that jump off the page? I noticed a couple of different games that were in the 30s from an over-under perspective, which is always intriguing from college football, not from a daily fantasy rostering perspective, but simply I think the BC game was somewhere around 39, just how bad those offenses can be, or you could say how good the defenses could be. But Joe, anything jump out at you to sort of lay the groundwork to get into the plays coming up here in mere moments?
No, but it's interesting that you mentioned some of that because you could even go to Vanderbilt, Florida as well, right? But then when you look across from that, you got Texas Tech, West Virginia. You've got a host of games. You got Tulsa, maybe UCF, which maybe you're going to take players from one side. Cincinnati, Houston. I think there's some interesting matchups here where we can get some points across the board. And like you mentioned, defense, Notre Dame, Pittsburgh. I mean, there's another one just looking at that one as well. So it's sort of pick your poison. FanDuel's got Penn State, Northwestern, another defensive game. So just got to be real selective this week.
So, Ben, let's start. I know you talked about the quarterback position and who you decided to write up and who you're fading. And on any given week, you can't write everybody up. You're going to come to a point where you need to trim the fat a little bit and figure out exactly who you like best. And there are going to be guys left off. We'll get to the guys left off in a minute. Who are some of your top plays at quarterback, and who are you willing to pay up for on both sides?
Okay, yeah. So I made a big mistake last week. I'll admit it. I mean, it was probably my biggest mistake of the year with Texas Tech, Oklahoma State. The game came out with an 80 total, and I pretty much disregarded the whole matchup, the whole game, which was really foolish of me because I thought Oklahoma State's defense was better than they actually are, and in doing so, did not write up Patrick Mahomes. I did not write up Jakeem Grant. I mean, obviously Oklahoma State's such a weird offense that it's hard to really write up anybody there. I did write up J.W. Walsh, and he had an okay performance and reached value, but just overall, I messed up. I'm not going to do that this week. I'm writing up Patrick Mahomes. He has some crazy, weird home-away splits going on, and that is the only reason I'm a little cautious with playing him. But the total's huge. I think it's 79 if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it's 79. West
Mhm.
Virginia is slightly favored 8.5 at this time. But Mahomes is a super quarterback. He can run, he can pass, but he's played much better in Lubbock, and that scares me. But I think he'll be fine. I think he'll have a really good game. He's priced ridiculously cheap on DraftKings in comparison to everybody else. He's only 7,600. FanDuel, he's more right there with everybody, the Greg Wards of the world and everything. So I'm not as convinced there when you only have to pick one. But on DraftKings, he gives you so much flexibility by forcing him in. I mean, you can put him alongside Boykin and still make a roster because he's so cheap. I like Boykin. I like Evans. I hate Evans, but I like Evans in this matchup. Greg Ward, which we mentioned. I think in the mid-price range, Skylar Howard, the same matchup is brilliant for him. They have a huge team total. They've been reeling. They've lost like 4 straight. West Virginia has. But I like Howard. I like all of the tools he has, and he has a young receiving core that will have flash brilliance and then flash nothing at the same time. I think the sleeper guy is going to be Chad Kelly because people look at Arkansas and automatically assume great defense. It's not really the case when it comes to pass defense. And Kelly throws a lot. I mean, you're talking about a guy who could easily get to 380 yards and not miss a beat with 3 talented wide receivers in Adebayoy and Core and Treadwell and even Evan Ingram, who we might bring up a little bit later.
Chad Kelly with a 50-plus attempt week last week, several 40-plus attempt weeks, and we've talked about it many times across all football. It's opportunity, it's volume, and these guys, when you get the price tag, like a Chad Kelly at 6,700, and he's going to be throwing that much, could give you some high upside there when constructing your lineups. Now, when dealing with quarterbacks right now, Joe, and from your rankings, and you said a lot of season long is coming down to the wire here from the season long perspective. Are there quarterbacks that you're trusting more than others when you're doing your rankings? Are there guys you're seeing that are more consistent outputs that you trust more from a daily fantasy perspective and price tags that you're appreciating? Or is it a simple situation where we talk about this a lot that it varies so widely that's not that easy to pigeonhole?
I think the greatest edge that you get from college fantasy football is being able to identify the matchups on a week-to-week basis. But with that being said, the one thing that we seem to talk about every week are the Corey Colemans, the Josh Doxsons, the Trevon Boykins. Consistency rings the bell. At some of these top guys, like Ben mentioned, you got Greg Ward sitting there. I mean, we have Greg Ward once again, our number 1 rated quarterback. I mean, he's going up against Cincinnati this week. So I think if you're gonna really pay up for a guy, you're gonna go with the guys that have been consistent and doing it all year. And then if they have a bad week, well, they have a bad week. I can live with that because you're paying up for consistency. That's what you want. And so, even a name that you threw, I saw Pat Mahomes on DraftKings too for 7,600. I think it's a no-brainer, Ben. I look at him and I'm like, man, how do you not jump on him playing West Virginia? And then I got Howard over there on FanDuel as well as value. And I even think a guy like Berkovici, if you're going somewhere around 7,300 for Arizona State playing Washington State, has a lot of value this week as well.
It's a situation with Dane Evans facing UCF and how terrible UCF has been on defense throughout this entire season, where it just gets that extra bump up in value there. And I'm glad that week over week we can continue to pick on Rutgers, because I'm really glad that's a theme we've stuck to and one that's worked out very well for us throughout this season. Joe, looked like you had a follow-up there.
Yeah, I was just going to say something to Evan there in the chat room, and I know we'll get to wide receivers outside of Jakeem Grant, who's the most trustable receiver on Texas Tech right now. I think you got to look at Ian Sadler, inside receiver. I think he's going to get a lot of targets this week playing West Virginia, so I'm sure we'll get into that as we get into the receivers. I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of us.
Never a problem. Always good to answer the question in chat and keep the conversation going. As we look at running back, Ben, what Christian McCaffrey has done this season has been, I use the phrase fun to watch a lot, but college football has some of these storylines that emerge throughout the year, and watching McCaffrey play and watching what Stanford does on offense, he's just one of those backs that I'll always enjoy turning on the TV and watching him play. Is he your top option this week, regardless of price tag, or do you see a price point along with talent that is almost hard to deny?
Yeah, I mean, he's Christian McCaffrey. I mean, at this point, if you haven't tuned in to watch this guy, you're missing out. I didn't understand why Stanford didn't give him a bigger role earlier in the year, and when he finally started to get a chance, I mean, it's just been his show. He's even getting the goal line carries now. They don't even worry about giving the ball to Raymond Wright. But Wright's still looming. He's still going to steal a goal line carry every once in a while, and that stinks because you see McCaffrey rush for 40 yards down the field and doesn't get to cash it in sometimes. But he's 8,900 on FanDuel. That's like almost a must play to me. That's not so. He's not even in the 9Ks. He's not in the 10Ks. So you got to push him in and then start from there. Now rostering him alongside an expensive quarterback like Mahomes and Boykin on FanDuel, it will get a little hairy. You're going to have to figure out some other guys, but McCaffrey is such a talent and so much ahead of everybody else with the fact that he can catch the ball so well, the fact that he is like in a perfect matchup against Colorado, who's just been destroyed lately on the ground. It only makes sense to put him in, put a big quarterback in, and try to filter out through your wide receivers or maybe your second running back. Save somewhere else. You don't need to save those two places on FanDuel.
Lots of options elsewhere at running back with some price tags that you can piece some things together. Ben's write-up is available, as we joked earlier about its availability more than 24 hours in advance of kickoff at noon on Saturday. But one of the guys that I know we've debated a lot here on the show, and will he play, won't he play, and if he plays, what's his role going to be, is Corey Clement, Joe. And Ben, part of the write-up there, Corey Clement, not giving away too much there, as I know he's been a feature back for you, Ben, trying to get him in your DFS lineups. But Joe, from your...
We're not going to talk about it, Dan. The 1 week we don't write him up, the 1 week we don't play him, he gets in, he finally gets in, they don't tell us, and he rushes 11 friggin' times for 100 and like, I don't even know, 30 yards and 3 friggin' touchdowns. And that makes me so mad. I don't even want to talk about it.
And that's why I'm going to Joe with this question. Yep. Joe, from a storyline perspective, dealing with these running backs and dealing with these running backs by committee and these injuries, and that's a story that I think if you're in a large-scale tournament, you maybe threw Corey Clement in thinking, matchup, and maybe he comes through and I'll take the risk. But from a cash game perspective, it was too much of an unknown, obviously, to roster Clement last week. Week over week, though, now that we're back and he, as Ben writes up, he's on the bench, but he's Corey Clement. He has so much talent. Where's your risk right now with someone like Clement? How much are you willing to take on? How much are you willing to invest in him? Do you see a price point conversation here where once he reaches a certain price, you need to know he's going to get more carries? Or do you see it as, hey, this kid's talented, I'm going to take the risk and hope that he gets the lion's share of the runs?
Well, I think what we have to look at, and I say this, it seems like week after week, whenever there's injuries, you always want to err on the side of caution, right? And so for a couple of weeks, we've been talking about Corey Clement, and then all of a sudden he shows up and boom, he cashes in for 2, goes for 100 yards. But you know what? At least you didn't have him and he didn't sit, which would have hurt you a heck of a lot more than not knowing that he was going to play. Now that he's in there, we know what Corey Clement's going to be. And look, he didn't get a ton of carries, and I didn't expect him. I don't think any of us expect him to get a ton of carries. He hasn't played since week 1, and he barely played in that game. So, I mean, it was to think that he was going to go out there and get 30 carries the first time out, I think was a little – that it wasn't going to happen. But now that we see a guy like Corey Clement hit the field, now we can begin to expect a little bit more from him, I think, on a weekly basis as we move forward.
Ben, who do you like from a value perspective this week? We can stop talking about Corey Clement. Who do you like from a value perspective? Who are guys that if we're rostering Mahomes and Boykin and maybe going to McCaffrey, who's a guy that maybe has the opportunity to far exceed their price tag or give us that little extra jump from a value perspective?
So if you're rostering maybe not Mahomes, but if you're rostering like Boykin or Ward, and you also have Christian McCaffrey on FanDuel, then your running back's pretty much done for you. It's going to be Wendell Smallwood. You got a guy who has stolen the job, which he should have had to begin with, because Russell Shell is crap. He's 6,700 on FanDuel, which is stupid cheap for what he offers you in this kind of matchup. He's a 6.5 carry a guy who's rushed for over 100 yards in 3 of his last 4 games. He plays Texas Tech, who is giving up 270.7 yards per game on the ground. To give you a frame of reference, New Mexico State, Texas State, and Eastern Michigan are the only teams in FBS giving up more yards on the ground. That means Texas Tech is down there with New Mexico State, Texas State, and Eastern Michigan. That is like the crap of college football defenses. So if you're looking at it like that, then you got to just assume that they're going to be playing at home. Smallwood's it's an ideal matchup. So even if you play him and he doesn't do great, doesn't get in the end zone, which is a risk you take with Smallwood, he doesn't have a ton of touchdowns. He doesn't have that upside in him unless he's breaking it from deep. That I don't know why, but he doesn't have a lot of touchdowns. In this situation, you're playing the smart guy. Smallwood is the smart play. DeMario Richard is right behind him. He's only 7,100. Arizona State against Washington State. Same situation, but Washington State's a little bit better defensively. Great against the pass, not so great against the run. Richard has been a beast, but he's sharing carries at this point with Ballage, who is just as powerful, just as great a runner as he is. So that's a little confusing to me. I don't know. I have to get Joe. I'm I'm not a homer for Tennessee football, but I hear about Jalen Hurts so much that like I have a predisposition. He's like from 30 minutes down the road from me. So I've heard about him since he was in high school. I know all about him, and I have a very high opinion of him as a DraftKings play for 6,300 against the South Carolina defense that's giving up over 200 yards on the ground. And has been thrashed as recently as last week by a guy like Kyler Murray, who Hurd is just as fast as Kyler Murray, and he's bigger. So I'm curious to see what Joe has to say about Jalen Hurd.
Here's what I'll say about Jalen Hurd. I have the running backs written down, and let me tell you something. You already mentioned one, Wendell Smallwood. I have a star by his name. On DraftKings at 6,700, I don't know how you don't play him. When I look at right now, and I'm looking at DraftKings right now, if you want to stay away from McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, Alex Collins, there's 3 names in a row that I love on that list. I love Kenneth Farrow at 6,500 playing Cincinnati, Jalen Hurd at 6,300 playing South Carolina. And I like Wendell Smallwood. I mean, all 3 of those guys. Boom, boom, boom. I like all 3 of those guys right there. None of them are at the top tier. They're all mid-level guys. I like them all. And then one other name I'll throw out there as well, because there was a lot of discussion on what was going on over at Iowa last week. And we did like Akram Wadley, but we knew LaShawn Daniels was coming back. LaShawn Daniels probably got more carries than I think most people expected. And this week he's 4,100 at DraftKings, 55 on FanDuel. I even think he's an option this week at Indiana.
Some great names there, and you're going to find the ability to mix and match at the running back position. Get some guys who are high volume at pretty decent price tags where you're going to be able to get up to some talented wide receivers and some talented quarterbacks. Ben, is the DraftKings pricing this early slate as soft as it seems?
Initially I thought that, and when I started to really dig into it a little bit harder, I want to roster expensive players, so it's not quite as soft as maybe I'd even want it to be. I mean, I like to play FanDuel. I do play DraftKings to stay sharp over there, but for me personally, I shade more to FanDuel because I think softer pricing actually will work to my advantages for GPPs. Now, for cash games, DraftKings is better just because if you're going to be sharp and you're going to be on top of it, it gives you an advantage. But I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it because I know I want to spend on my quarterbacks, but just because I don't see a whole lot, in that. If you'll look at the write-up and you see the punt guys, I mean, it's Beathard from Iowa, it's Nick Mitchell, and Jake Rudock. I mean, those guys are crap. Like you're talking about really bad players, but that's all you have in the cheap area. So unless you're going with 2 mid-tier guys, which doesn't make a lot of sense, you're going to be screwed the whole rest of your lineup construction because I mean, like we talked about, I mean, Joe brought up a lot of guys that are in the 6K range, which is fine. But if you're rostering 6K running backs, you're having to roster 4.5K wide receivers or
Yep.
5K wide receivers. And then it gets like a little bit more difficult because I think there are good guys in that range, like Josh Atkinson, which we'll get into here in a little bit, but it's not as clear cut. So I don't know. I'm 50-50.
We can head over to wide receivers, and a question from the chat earlier from Evan Thompson discussing Ryan Switzer, wide receiver from UNC. He lists him as an all-purpose guy. Ben, maybe we can lead off the conversation with Switzer and work our way back to top options. Switzer is, let's check here on DraftKings, a $4,200 wideout eligible last week. Against Pittsburgh, had a TD, had 5 receptions, 126 yards, so obviously coming off of a good week. Do you see UNC's matchup with Duke as a quality one for the Tar Heels, and do you see Switzer as a potential, I'll say punt? He's on the much lower end of price tags here, working your way in a DraftKings lineup.
Yeah, I looked at him. It wasn't a long look just because of the way that their offense plays and the fact that I don't know a whole lot about Duke's defense because we just haven't seen them play tough offenses. They didn't play that great last week, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be dealing with this like a Switzer outbreak. He has had 15 targets in his last 2 weeks, which is great. He does have the kick return value, so he could get randomly a 6-point touchdown. So he has that value. I think if you're going to punt on DraftKings, you might as well just go down. There's plenty of options in the under 4K range that I think are good. We might as well get into them. David Sills from West Virginia, the quarterback turned wide receiver who is so athletic that he's kind of pressed his way into this. Their wide receiver play has been pretty lackluster, so that's why also. But he's very athletic, Johnny Manziel type talent. They've actually compared him to him. So I'm curious to see how he develops in the future. But for now, he's a wide receiver that's 3,100 on DraftKings against a bad defense. So we have Traquan Smith and Tristan Payton for Central Florida playing Tulsa. Central Florida may not win a game. They may not win a game the rest of the season. But Tulsa's defense is so bad that Central Florida's offense has to rise up a little. I mean, Holman isn't completely pathetic. He has to, have games every once in a while. And Smith has proved himself over and over again. He's only 3,700. There's other guys. Baker's the same price. I almost would rather have him because I know I can count on at least a few red zone targets. And then you have the Iowa boys, Vandenberg and Tavon Smith. I like all those guys over Switzer, so that's why he didn't make the write-up.
As a matter of fact, when it comes to Switzer, Ben, when it comes to Switzer, one guy that we were going to write up in our start bench was Thomas Sirk, the quarterback at Duke. And the more I looked at that game, it's sort of the defense is a sort of bend don't break. I was surprised at just how few points both of those teams give up. I'm really curious to see where the score goes with that. So that's my concern with a guy like Switzer. Maybe you get a handful of catches and a few yards here, but I'm worried about whether or not there's scoring involved with that. So, but Ben, one name you threw up there that I do like this week is I do like Vandenberg over there at Iowa, and you mentioned Beathard as well at the quarterback spot at 5,500. They're playing against the worst pass defense in the FBS in Indiana, right? So if you're looking for a real cheap combination, that's it right there. I was looking at Traquan Smith at Central Florida going up against Tulsa. I agree with you with that one. James Washington, the wide receiver, Oklahoma State's 4,500. Coming off a 200-yard game, they're playing TCU this week. I think, and I think Colby Listenby on both sides is worth a shot. He's 4,800 DraftKings, 5,600 on FanDuel. And one name that I'll throw out, and this guy's been really inconsistent, especially for a lot of season-long guys as well. And if you've had him in daily as well, but he seems to show up sometimes in really big games. I'm really curious to see what Artavis Scott does for Clemson this week against Florida State. He's not high priced. He's only 5,900 on FanDuel. I think he's an option this week.
Clemson up front in the college football playoff rankings. Will be interesting to see how they react and what's going on with college football as we move forward in deciding who makes that 14 playoff come winter. I believe it's on New Year's Eve this year, not New Year's Day, which has a lot of people pissed off. But that's his life, and we move forward with that. Ben, who's your top play at wideout? Who's the guy that you're building rosters around, or at least making considerable adjustments to get into your lineup?
I mean, I want to roster Josh Doxson, but the actual ability to roster him with all the other guys we've talked about in the other positions isn't plausible. Really, not going to happen. I think he figures always better on FanDuel, where you can deal with a high price wide receiver a little easier. Garrett at 6,800 is almost 1,500 cheaper than Josh Doxson and has the same kind of upside. Now Doxson has some incredible stats, like over 129 yards and 2 touchdowns in every single game in the last 6. That's sick. In the last 2 games, he has almost hit 200 yards in each. He had a 270-yard performance just 4 games ago. So we're talking about a guy who has extreme upside, like upside on a whole nother planet. And if you think Boykin is going to have a good game, then Doxson's going to have a good game. They run hand in hand. So I think Doxson is a great option. Is he an option that you're going to roster? Maybe. If you have to put in like DeMario Richard and Smallwood, and then maybe go even cheaper on your quarterback to make sure that you get in a Doxson on FanDuel. Now on DraftKings, you got to do a whole lot more work than that. I like Garrett a lot against Central Florida. It's a team that's giving up a lot of passing yards. I think Treadwell's a very under the radar play, like we talked about with Arkansas. They're giving up 273 yards per game through the air. So Treadwell, who is maybe doesn't have the upside of Doxson and doesn't have the upside of Garrett, is a consistent bet to get 7-8 catches, over 100 yards, multiple touchdowns because of the way he plays. He's incredible in the end zone when the ball's thrown to him. You just have to watch it. So I like him a lot. Then when you go into the medium tier, the next tier of guys, Erickson's going to get a lot of targets for Wisconsin with Wheelwright out. He should get a boost in the red zone. Maryland's defense is scrappy. I think I even used that word in the write-up because whenever I've gone at them and targeted them, especially with running backs, they've stopped them. And I don't know how Wisconsin's going to play this game on the road, but he's only 6,800 on FanDuel. He's not available on DraftKings. Erickson has a little bit of value for me. Atkinson is the guy you want to watch. We brought up Washington. I think he's a great play. Dom Williams, Shaq Washington are all great plays. Josh Atkinson is an X factor on DraftKings because he's only 5,500. He's a guy that had 100 yards in every single game going up into last week. He had an injury, so we didn't know if he was actually going to play. Played barely, didn't do much. I have a feeling he's a little bit more healthy. So we're talking about a guy 5,500 who has 100-yard upside. You kind of have to squeeze him in, and he's going to be more the way you get exposure to Tulsa, even more so than maybe Garrett. So I think that's where you go there. We talked about the cheap wide receivers, so I'll let Joe give his guys.
Well, the one thing that I won't recommend anyone doing is fading Josh Doxson. I mean, we talk about him. We talk about Corey Coleman. I mean, he's been money in the bank. So to team him with Boykin, yeah, if you can make that work, I think you got to. You brought up Erickson. I like Erickson on FanDuel. I'll bring up a name, too, that I like. A couple of receivers in a game that I like. We didn't bring – I like – well, first of all, Laquan Treadwell. We talked about him last week. Ride the wave while he's hot. Now's the time to ride Laquan Treadwell. And in the red zone, his hands are a magnet to the ball. The Washington State-Arizona State game, a couple of intriguing options at wide receiver. I do like Gabe Marks and I do like Tim White. I think those are some nice plays in that game if you're looking for two in that particular game. But, other than that, DraftKings, I got DeMarcus Ayers at 6,100, even Shelton Gibson for 5,500. If Skylar Howard can get things going against Texas Tech, I think man, look, his ceiling is high as anybody. If he catches a couple of those deep balls, that's a guy. It's amazing. He goes for 30 yards. It looks like he's open and can catch for 150 yards on a given week. They just can't get him the ball. But there's Erickson, Tim White, Colby Listenby. We went through them all. One name that I will mention, I brought up earlier, Ian Sadler, Texas Tech. He is back. It's an inside target. He's going to get a lot of targets coming his way as that inside receiver. I like him at 4,100 on DraftKings playing against West Virginia this week.
Then the one question in chat here: how about Antonio Callaway from Florida?
Florida wide receivers are a big bugaboo of mine. Like it's like one that I can't quite nail. They rotate. Demarcus Robinson steps up. Callaway steps up. Powell steps up. It's a rotating group of guys that step up, and then nobody steps up alongside each other. But Callaway's very talented. He's a guy that's going to have a big, bright future there. But to just zone in on him, unless you're playing GPPs, it's going to be tough.
Yeah, and I'll even interject right there. I mean, look, these Florida receivers, I mean, look, Callaway made one big play last week. I mean, 3/4 of his points came off of one play. And from a seasonal standpoint, when we do our rankings, it's just really hard to have these guys from week to week. The consistency is just not there. So they're really hard. You're sometimes throwing darts at some of these Florida receivers.
Question from Travis in chat there as well, and then we can talk tight ends in this early slate and touch on the late slate before we say so long for this Thursday night. But is running back and wide receiver so good this week? Would punting QB be an option? Now, Ben, you touched on a couple of the cheaper end options from a quarterback position, but can you run the risk on DraftKings of going too cheap QBs and trying to nail the skills position at wide receiver and running back with so much talent available?
I mean, if Wilton Spate was in there, I would say yes. You could possibly do it. With my opinion is if you're not going below medium range, if you're not doing like two guys like maybe Kelly Howard. If you did that combo, then I could see you working some magic otherwise, but that'd be as cheap as I would go. I just really don't think it's smart to fade all the top options, especially on DraftKings. FanDuel, it would depend on your roster construction because, I mean, you can look at this midweek slate. I built some rosters around Kilton Anderson from Fresno State that are cashing GPPs simply because I knew that Kilton Anderson probably wouldn't do anything, but it allowed me to have salary to spend up on wide receivers. I mean, I had a roster with Coleman, Davis, and Roger Lewis. And I did that on purpose because I knew that, you have to make that decision. And this week, I don't think you need to do that. I think you need to have an expensive quarterback in your early slate, or at least mid-tier.
Tight ends, Ben, where are we going? Is this a mix and match sort of week where the price tags remain low on FanDuel, or do you see somebody as the better value and better option at tight end?
Yeah, I'm kind of done with tight ends. It's just one of those positions that done. I'm done. No, I actually think nailing the tight end is a crucial way to win a GPP. It's funny how it works because if you hit the tight end that's like 5% owned or 6% or even 20% that hits the touchdown and has maybe a couple catches. Fumagalli was that guy earlier in the year. You've gotten guys like Ingram is starting to step up. Both those guys are great options. Austin Hooper is every bit the focal point of the Stanford offense at this point, the passing offense at least. Just the Stanford passing offense is non-existent. So all those guys are good options. You'll have to stay tuned to the Iowa tight end situation. I wrote them both up. I have really no clue who the guy is that steps up. For me, it's going to be one of those three that I mentioned earlier.
Anybody for you, Joe? And I know we also get some of these tight ends eligible as wide receiver on DraftKings. They can become flex players and cheaper options. I know I've used Hooper in that regard previously, but anybody for you, Joe?
Well, you look at I've mentioned Jordan Leggett before in the past as well, but the problem with Hooper and Leggett is you're going to get maybe 2 catches and maybe get a touchdown. I think if you really wanted to take a shot at going big, you take a look at Arizona State, Washington State. You got Cody Cole for Arizona State. And then, like Ben said, maybe Ole Miss scores some points, forces Arkansas into a passing situation, and maybe you jump on somebody like Hunter Henry for Arkansas. I think those would be 2 names I'd be watching this week over at tight end.
That is the early slate of games. Ben, Joe giving out a lot of great content there. We'll get to the start sit from Joe in a few moments. if you're not yet a member of Fantasy Insiders and you're watching this broadcast, watching on YouTube or happening upon it on iTunes while setting your lineups, it's fantasyinsiders.com/plans. You can find out more information on how to become involved over there. And Fantasy Insiders currently in beta on a new site look. So it's beta.fantasyinsiders.com. You can head over, try it out, see how you like it, and submit feedback to the leadership team over at FI to make the site as best as possible for you to use. And now user profiles, not far off. I know David Kitchen tweeting about that earlier, which will be a lot of fun to see on the site as well.
A lot of work has gone into that, guys. So please, help us get good feedback, kind of figure it out. We've spent a lot of time and effort and money and everything trying to make the site more user friendly and more pretty. If that, I can't say more pretty, prettier. So definitely.
Ben, you can say more pretty.
I'm from Tennessee. You get to do whatever you want with the English language down here. So I fully feel fine saying more pretty. But yeah, it's definitely something I know David spent a ton of time. I mean, that's basically been his obsession over the last couple months, and which is why you haven't seen a whole lot from him. So definitely go look at it, give us feedback, let us figure out all these little bugs and things.
And what Fantasy Insiders is doing with shows like this, with the podcast, with the site redesign, is really trying to foster the community and keep you guys coming around, talking on the forums, discussing the articles, being able to talk to Ben and the likes throughout all the different sports. Now, Ben, if we take a quick eye on this late slate, which I assume your write-up will be out 24 hours before kickoff again. I mean, I don't want to put any pressure on you.
No, it's not going to happen.
But who stands out to you? And Joe, feel free to chime in here as part of the conversation. Are there top plays that you're focusing on from a roster construction standpoint?
Yeah, so I'm just now really digging into it. I've started framing before we came onto the show, and I wrote down all the spreads. I mean, this slate is ripe. It's ripe for fun college football watching too. I mean, we've got games with Oklahoma against the cupcake Iowa State, but then we have Michigan State, Nebraska, which two bad pass defenses. I mean, you have Navy, Memphis on DraftKings. I mean, the list goes on. Texas A&M against both teams have really bad run defenses, and both teams are good at running the football right now. So it's just a really exciting. And then you always have your Pac-12 games. You have Ohio State versus Minnesota, which scares the crap out of me, and LSU against Alabama. So as far as the games standpoint goes, you're going to want to get the Pac-12 guys. You're going to want to go after the Cal-Oregon game that has a 75-point total, the Arizona USC game that has a 66.5 total. Those are the guys we're wanting to go after. As far as plays go, love Jared Goff. I think Baker Mayfield has another great performance, but you always have to be careful in a situation where he's playing a bad run defense. I get a little weary in that I think that they might start running the ball again, especially since we nailed that play earlier in the year, a couple weeks back. I get a little weird about Mayfield against Iowa State because I'm afraid that Pirine and Mixon go nuts, and Mayfield maybe has like 2 touchdown passes and 400 yards. With how expensive he is, that's not a great way to attack the slate. Quentin Flowers for South Florida is unbelievably cheap on DraftKings. I don't know why they pushed him that low. I know he had a bad game last week, but he's only 5,700. That doesn't make a lot of sense for a guy that can run for 150 plus yards in any given week. Do you want me to touch on some of the other plays, or do we want to just stick quarterbacks?
I think quarterbacks is a good place to start here, and foundational plays. You'll have to check out the rankings over on the CFF site and check out the write-up Ben has when it does come out. Joe, how about yourself? Quarterback plays Saturday night that you're focusing on.
A couple out there. You mentioned Jared Goff, Ben. I think even Vernon Adams is an intriguing play. How is Kyler Murray not an intriguing play when he can run for 150 yards himself? And then look, we talked about how bad the Nebraska pass defense is. I love Connor Cook this weekend as well. I don't know how you don't like him. I like Connor Cook. So those are, Kyler Murray, Vernon Adams, Connor Cook. Those are 3 more names I'll throw out there on the late slate this week that I do like.
So we will close out the show, as has become custom here, with Ben's hot take of the week. Guy from the early slate or couple. Maybe he'll give us another one of these A-B comparisons as well. No pressure, but we'll see what Ben comes up with here. Joe, first, start sit. You also talked about the focus of the college football season coming down to the wire here. Start sits all that more important. The floor is yours for the CFF site start sit for week 10 of the college football season.
Yeah, so, we were talking off the air before the show, and this is the point of the year where a lot of the season-long guys were starting to get to the playoffs, right? So a lot of the season's winding down. And you know what? Many thanks to the emails that are coming in. Joe, this is the first year I'm playing college fantasy football. I found your site. I'm leading my league. I love hearing those stories, guys. Let those testimonials, bring them on in. But remember, as you're moving forward here, the season doesn't stop. Ben, these guys over at Fantasy Insiders, they do some tremendous work. And now's the time, as good as ever, that if you're done with your season-long league, give Daily Fantasy a shot. And I'm telling you, these guys over here at Fantasy Insiders, Ben and the rest of the team, they do some quality work. I see it, guys, every week. So I'm telling you, I couldn't recommend it more. There's a reason I'm part of this team. Look, they're the best in the business, guys. I like to think that we've got a lot of good things going for you season-long guys and daily fantasy guys. And we're only going to continue that all the way through the bowl season. And I'll just throw out there real quick, a lot of you guys will thank you for purchasing our preseason draft guide over at the CFF site. And for the first year, this year, we'll actually launch a fantasy bowl guide as well for you daily fantasy players, for your season-long guys that are looking to redraft. Many thanks. Just want to let you know what's going on the horizon as we end up with some of your seasonal leagues. We're going to get right into the Week 10 start bench. And, guys, we're going to go ahead and we're going to begin with the starts this week. And, we're going to start with a big name, big game. We're going to go to LSU, Alabama. And, we were burned earlier this year with recommending a player on a start when we recommended starting Alex Collins against the Alabama defense. But, guys, it's Leonard Fournette. You season-long guys have ridden him all year, and there's no sense to getting off the saddle now. Earlier this year when we recommended Alex Collins, we did get burned, but we're going back to the well in Week 10 with Leonard Fournette. The Heisman candidates carried your team all year. We're going to ride them even against the nation's third best run defense. For you season-long guys, Leonard Fournette, Week 10 start, and we're going to stay in that game with Derrick Henry. LSU has the sixth best run defense in the FBS, allowing fewer than 100 yards a game. But, we're expecting a heavy dose of Derrick Henry, Leonard Fournette. As long as this game's tight, guys, those guys are going to get a ton of carries. And if Derrick Henry's going to rack up 25-plus carries, that junior back, he's worth the start this week. We're calling Leonard Fournette and Derrick Henry both a start in Week 10 in what could be a 3 yards in a cloud of dust for a while. We'll go to a Friday night game. Algie Brown, running back, BYU, playing San Jose State. He scored at least 2 touchdowns in 3 consecutive games. That's a trend that could continue through Week 10 when the Cougars travel to San Jose State to face a Spartans defense that's given up over 225 yards per game on the ground. Algie Brown, running back, BYU, a Week 10 start at San Jose State. And a name that we talked about a little bit earlier on the slate, Matt Vanderberg, wide receiver, Iowa. It's not a name that we recommend every week on starting, but he's up there in the rankings for us this week. He's accounted for at least 6 receptions in 5 of Iowa's first 8 games this year. And in Week 10, Iowa travels to Indiana, faces the worst pass defense in the FBS. The Hoosiers are allowing over 340 yards per game in the air, and they've given up 21 passing touchdowns this year. If there's a week you're going to start Matt Vanderberg, this is the week to do it, and I think that goes for daily and seasonal. Now, guys, we're going to hop over to the bench. That's where we're going to end it. And, we're going to start with the Utah-Washington game. The Huskies' defense, they're allowing fewer than 17 points a game. That's tops in the Big 12. So we're not expecting the scoreboard to light up Saturday night when the Utes travel to Washington. Washington doesn't give up many points. Utah doesn't give up many points. We're calling for Travis Wilson, Week 10 bench at Washington this Saturday. Cody Kessler, quarterback, USC, and this is something to notice for daily and seasonal as well. They're playing Arizona this week. Even though they're playing Arizona, who's struggling, Kessler's only thrown 3 touchdown passes in the Trojans' previous 4 games, and he just lost Juju Smith-Schuster. Lost to a hand injury. He's out for an indefinite period of time. I think the Trojans are going to lean heavily on their improved rushing attack. They've got a 3-headed monster. They got Ronald Jones, Trey Madden, Justin Davis. They can recycle the fresh bodies. I think they're going to lean on those guys when they host Arizona Saturday night. We're calling for Cody Kessler, Week 10 bench versus Arizona. Then we're going to go to receiver. Leonte Carew, we say it every year, every week. We did it with Corey Clement. We've got to be careful with these injury guys. Look, Carew is undoubtedly maybe the most talented player on the field if he plays. But you know what? There's too many questions surrounding not only his health, but they've got a road game at Michigan. That's concerning because he's going against one of the best defenses in the nation. So even if he does play, how effective will he be? I'm not too sure that he will be. I'm calling for a Week 10 bench. Leonte Carew, wide receiver, Rutgers, at Michigan. And two more names. Jordan Howard, running back, Indiana, playing Iowa. There are a few factors working against Howard this Saturday, even though the Hoosiers are playing at home against the undefeated Hawkeyes. Iowa's have the 6th best scoring defense, so his scoring opportunity is going to be limited. They've got the 5th best run defense in the nation. They're only giving up 85 yards a game. And guys, Iowa has only allowed 1 rushing touchdown this year. 1 rushing touchdown, the only team in the FBS. I think that's a recipe for a disaster if you're starting him. Jordan Howard, Week 10 bench versus Iowa. And the last name we're going to throw out. Most guys I don't think would think to bench this guy this week. But, guys, we're going to recommend benching Cardell Jones, quarterback, Ohio State, playing Minnesota this week, even though the job is his because J.T. Barrett's out on suspension. Cardell Jones hasn't accounted for more than 2 touchdowns in a game since the Buckeyes season opener at Virginia Tech. The junior quarterback has been erratic, and there's a reason why he lost the starting job to J.T. Barrett, who is on suspension. Ohio State's probably going to lean heavily on Ezekiel Elliott this week. And don't be surprised to see a little bit of Braxton Mills sprinkled into the play call on Saturday night when the Buckeyes host Minnesota. We're calling for Cardell Jones, Week 10 bench, at home against Minnesota, and those guys are your Week 10 start bench.
Great stuff as always, Joe. Some big names in there to stay away from and some names to keep an eye on from a daily perspective as well as you are constructing your lineup, some value in there. Ben, as we come to the close of the show tonight, you have been bringing us some hot takes week over week, guys that maybe are going to exceed value or just are a gut take of a high octane performance. Who do you have for us this week?
Yeah, they haven't been quite as hot lately. I think I screwed up last week. Yeah, very tepid takes. Actually, we're going to go to the tight end this week. I'm going to go with Evan Ingram gets over 100 yards for the first time this season for Ole Miss against Arkansas. He's slowly seen his production uptick in the last couple games. Guy that's heavily integral in a situation where Arkansas may really try to take away Treadwell and some of the other wide receivers. I think Ingram is talented enough, and if his number's called enough, could easily break out for some big gains and big touchdowns. I mean, he did it last year. He's only 3,200 on FanDuel. I think that's going to be my big hot take this week is that Evan Ingram hits 100 yards receiving.
Great content from the both of you. We appreciate it. You can find Ben's write-up over on fantasyinsiders.com for the early slate, late slate coming soon. Check out the college football site. It's thecffsite.com. Find them on Twitter at the CFF site, and you can find Ben at Natural Slugger. And of course, as always, you can find Fantasy Insiders at Fantasy Insiders. And as we mentioned, beta.fantasyinsiders.com for the new look of the site. And your feedback is more than appreciated and welcomed throughout the forums there. So best of luck this weekend, guys. We will be back with you next Thursday at 11 p.m. Eastern Time to talk some college football in week number 11. Until then, best of luck, and we'll talk to you then.